Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, I would like to suggest that you make sure you've got a few things on hand. First of all, I'd like to suggest that you have a copy of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's just right down below this video. It'll take you to a place where you can print off a set for yourself. I'd also like to recommend that you have some communion elements, some bread or a cracker, some grape juice, some wine, really any beverage would suffice in a pinch. But I'd like to recommend that you have those things because when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion. So if you need any or all of those things, just press pause right now. Get together what you need, and once you've got everything in place, then go ahead and press play to resume the playback. Now my guess is that probably 99% of the people who will watch this video have worked a job or two or 20 over the course of their lives. And I wonder, in the various jobs that you've worked over the course of your life, have you ever had someone who didn't do that job tell you how you should do your job? Has that ever happened to you? I have a mother who was a school teacher, and growing up, I can tell you firsthand that there were plenty of times when my mother, as a school teacher, had parents who were not school teachers tell her how she should do her job. And I think there were a few moments where she did not necessarily appreciate that. My mom is one of the mildest mannered people that you could ever possibly meet, but I don't think that she really relished the experience of having parents who weren't school teachers tell her how to do her job as a school teacher. And I think that that is true for just about every profession out there. You know, another profession that I think is particularly susceptible to that is professional coaches. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to be a professional coach where literally, everybody out there who's watching you do your job as a professional coach, if you lose, they probably can tell you how you should have done your job better. I have said before, and I will say it again, I would never want to be a professional coach. I tip my cap to the men and women who do that as a career. I just think that would be miserable. I know that as a volunteer soccer coach over the last decade, I have had plenty of parents tell me how to do my job as a volunteer soccer coach. And if you're wondering whether or not I as a pastor have had non-pastors tell me how to do my job, oh yeah, you better believe I have. And I could tell you stories, unfortunately there's not time. Some of them crack me up and some of them make me cringe. Some of them I don't really have a lot of fond recollections of, but you know what? I mean, that's the nature of every job. Whether you're a pastor or a coach or a school teacher or whatever you do, there are definitely people out there who've never done the job who can tell you how to do your job better. And the interesting thing about our passage today is we're going to have some professionals have a mysterious stranger tell them how to do their job better. So be watching for that as we take a look at our lectionary passage. Our lectionary reading is for May 1st, 2022, and we are heading back to the Gospel of John. And what I want to do very quickly before we jump into this passage is I want to give a little bit of the context. First of all, this is John chapter 21. So at this point, we've already had the crucifixion of Jesus as well as the resurrection. At this point, Jesus has already appeared to the apostles on one occasion, doubting Thomas. You are probably familiar with that passage at the end of John chapter 20. Start of John chapter 20 is the resurrection itself. The second half of John chapter 20 is Jesus appearing to the disciples and doubting Thomas. Now we're jumping to the very next passage after that in the Gospel of John. And so let's take a look at it. Without any further ado, this is John chapter 21, verses 1 through 19, and this is a very slightly abridged version of this passage. It says, Jesus appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Peter jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter dragged the net ashore. It was full of 153 large fish. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." May God bless the reading of the challenging word. So this is a really interesting passage. And again, I've tried to give a little bit of context. Let me give some additional context now before we talk back through the passage, because the additional context, I think, is incredibly important. It's important for us to remember that the disciples, for most of Jesus' ministry, it seemed like they really didn't have a clue who Jesus was. And there was a point in Matthew chapter 16, so again, it's later in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus says to the disciples, who have been with him for a long time at this point, says, "Look, I know that some people are saying that I'm Elijah or one of the prophets, but who do you guys think that I am?" And at that point, the 12, I'm sure that they kind of looked at each other and said, "Well, who wants to say anything?" And out of the 12, it was Simon, aka Peter, but back then it was Simon. Simon says, "Well, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says to him, "Yes." He says, "That is the answer I've been looking for. Finally, one of you guys gets it. One of you guys understands." And Jesus goes on to say, "You are no longer Simon. You are Peter, Petros in the Greek." Petros. What words can you think of that come from Petra? Like petrified, as in made of rock? Jesus says to him, "You're no longer Simon, you are Petros, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell won't prevail against it." And I don't know how a lot of us would have reacted in that situation. I'm sure that if Jesus singled me out of the 12, I would have been pretty full of myself at that point. And I wonder if that might have played into it not long after that when they were in the upper room. And Jesus says to the disciples in the upper room, "One of you is going to betray me." And they start arguing about who's going to betray him. And Peter speaks up, Simon Peter speaks up and says, "Lord, I don't know about the rest of these goofballs, but I will never betray you, never ever." And Jesus says to him, "Interesting that you say that, because I can tell you this, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning at the start of the day, you will have denied me not once, not twice, but 3 times. And sure enough, as you know, that is exactly what happened. And so that context, I think, is incredibly important here, because there was a point where Simon was Simon and not Peter. And Jesus gave him a new name that meant the rock, because upon this rock, Jesus said, Peter, upon you, I'm going to build my church. And then not long after that, Peter said, I am your biggest supporter. I'm the one you can depend on when the chips are down. And then guess what? He ate those words. And he absolutely betrayed Jesus 3 times. I should say he denied Jesus 3 times. And since the resurrection, there hasn't really been a moment yet where Jesus and Peter have had the opportunity to have a heart-to-heart. So now it seems like they're having it. And they're having it there, it appears, in the presence of the other 10 disciples. Maybe Jesus pulled Peter aside before they had this conversation. This passage doesn't necessarily indicate that. Boy, if I was Peter, I would really have wanted Jesus to have this conversation with me away from the other disciples. I don't know. But let's very quickly go back through this passage. This is a passage that honestly I could spend 45 minutes preaching on this passage. And as you know, I have the constraint of this whole thing, the sermon and the communion time. I've got to be done in 23 minutes and 46 seconds. So I really can't do this the justice that I'd like to do it. But very quickly, keeping all of this in mind, let's look at what happens here. It appears that Jesus, even though Peter knows that Jesus has risen from the dead, and even though he saw him not too long before this, apparently, when they had that moment with Jesus kind of having I wouldn't call it a confrontation, but this meeting with Thomas, because Peter was there for that. So Peter knows that Jesus has risen from the dead, and yet it appears in this passage that Peter is going back to what he did before he ever met Jesus. Because before Peter ever met Jesus, what did he do? He was a professional fisherman. What does it sound like here? It sounds like Peter and some of the other disciples were going back to what they knew before. They're going back to being professional fishermen. So they're doing their fisherman thing, and they have had no luck whatsoever. And sometimes that happens to all of us in our profession. Sometimes we have a bad day or bad night in this case. And as they're out there having a really bad night and it's turning into morning, there's some yahoo on the shore that's shouting to them, "Hey, how are you doing?" "Terrible," they said. "Mind your own business." And then this yahoo, who at this point, the passage tells us they don't recognize that it's Jesus. Although based on what happens next, it seemed like maybe they kind of sort of suspected. Anyway, this yahoo on the shore says, "Hey, throw your net over on the other side of the boat," as if that's going to make a tiny bit of difference. Because they have been trolling this lake all night long. They've caught not a single thing. And now this expert on the shore is telling them, "Put your net on the other side of the boat." "Oh yeah, because that's going to solve all our problems." Except they did it, and guess what? It was the biggest haul of fish they'd ever caught in their entire lives. And so at this point, they have to realize something miraculous has just happened. And it's the disciple who Jesus loved, a.k.a. John, who says, "That's Jesus, that's him." And Peter is the one who is so excited that he jumps in the water and he goes swimming into shore to see Jesus first, while the rest of them are rowing the boat without Peter. "Thanks a lot, Peter. Thanks for all your help here. We got this massive haul of fish and you're leaving us behind to row it in by ourselves." So they get in there, they know it's Jesus, they have this meal. And at the end of the meal, Jesus says to Peter, and check this out, he doesn't call him Peter, he calls him Simon. You remember what Peter was before? He was Petros, before he was the rock upon which Jesus was going to build his church. I don't think that's any coincidence. Jesus says, "Simon, do you love me more than these?" And Peter says, well, yes, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, well then, feed my lambs. And then he repeats it. Simon, calls him Simon again. Ouch. Do you love me? And Peter says, yes, you know that I love you. He says, well, take care of my sheep. And then he asks him a third time, and now Peter's feeling really bad, and he says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. You're embarrassing me. You're making me feel bad. And Jesus says, all right then, feed my sheep. And then he kind of alludes to the fact that Peter would eventually be martyred for the gospel. We know that's true from church historians. The Bible doesn't necessarily tell us about Peter's martyrdom, but it seems fairly safe to assume from Christian tradition, from Christian historians, that that is in fact what happened to Peter. And then Jesus ends this by saying to him, follow me. And I wish I had more time. I want to point out one thing that's really important to you. If this dialogue between Jesus and Peter seems a little odd to you, why is Jesus repeating the question? It's because the English translation doesn't capture the nuance of what was happening in the Greek. So in the original Greek in which the New Testament was written, the word that Jesus is using for love and the word that Peter is using for love, they're two different words. And that's why this conversation is so awkward. Because Jesus says to Peter, Peter, do you agape me? And you've heard the word agape before. You know that agape means unconditional love. It is the ultimate. It is the highest form of love. Well, when Peter responds, yes, Lord, you know that I love you, he's not responding with agape. He's responding with phileo, which is brotherly love. As in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, yes, Lord, I phileo you. So Jesus says, no, that's not what I said, Peter. I said, do you agape me? Do you love me with the ultimate form of love? And Peter responds, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. So is Peter embarrassed because the other disciples are around? Even if Jesus has pulled Peter aside at this point, is Peter just feeling like this is maybe something that he's getting trapped by his own words? I don't know what was going through Peter's head at this point. Maybe he's just being honest at this point. I don't know. But they're using two different words for love. And if you want to check my math, please feel free to jump online and look this up for yourself. But I think that makes this so much more profound and so much more powerful. And so then, at the very end, check this out. And this is where it maybe even hurts even more. So Jesus has said, Peter, do you agape me? I phileo you. No, I said, do you agape me? I said I phileo you. Really, Peter? You know what Jesus says to him the last time, the third time? He says, Peter, do you phileo me? So it goes from, do you love me with the ultimate love? Do you love me with the ultimate love? Yes, I love you like a brother. Yes, I love you like a brother. And then Jesus, it seems like Jesus is saying to him, do you even love me like a brother? Are you sure about that, Peter? And that's where Peter's hurt. And he says, yes, Lord. He says, you know that I phileo you. So even the last time Peter says, you know that I love you like a brother. And so Jesus says, then feed my sheep. And then at the very end he says, follow me. All right, I've gone way too long. I have really got to hustle now. And so let's just very quickly, I wish I had more time. Let's quickly talk through the lessons of this passage for us. The first lesson is this. When we follow Jesus' instructions, good things usually happen. In this passage, Jesus tells them to do something that should not have worked at all. To take a net and to physically move it, 3 or 4 or 5 feet in the water? They were probably going to pass through that section of water in a few moments anyway, as the boat just drifted through the lake. And so, obviously, this was something supernatural that happened, this miraculous catch of fish. But that's the thing, is when we follow Jesus' instructions, good things usually happen. I wish I could say more. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is this. When we follow Jesus, he expects our full devotion. When we follow Jesus, he expects our full devotion. In this passage, Jesus says to Peter, he says, Peter, do you love me more than these? Basically saying, hey, Peter, it looks like you have decided that you aren't going to be a disciple anymore. It looks like you've decided you're going to go back to being a professional fisherman. And you're hanging out with all your buddies, and it looks like the rest of them are going back to being professional fishermen as well. Okay, well, do you love me more than your old life as a fisherman? Do you love me more than these guys? Because what Jesus was saying to Peter is, I haven't given up on you. Jesus was saying to him, I still expect you to be the rock upon which I build my church. So do you love me more than these? Do you still consider yourself devoted to me? Jesus was saying to Peter, I want your full devotion. And that's what Jesus says to all of us who consider ourselves to be disciples. That's the second lesson. Again, I wish I could say more. The third lesson is this. When we follow Jesus, this is the most important lesson of them all. When we follow Jesus, our failures aren't beyond redemption. You know, Peter had started off as one of the 12, and then all of a sudden Jesus singled him out in Matthew chapter 16 and said, you aren't Simon anymore, you are Petros, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church. You're the one. And then Peter had a very public, very embarrassing fall from this lofty position. He failed, and everybody knew it. And yet, now, in this albeit awkward and painful moment, Jesus says, Peter, your failures have not made you beyond redemption. So get out there and feed my sheep. Get out there and continue to follow me. And friends, when Jesus talks about agape, that ultimate form of love, we know that that's the love that Jesus had for us. So, very quickly, I'd encourage you to grab your communion elements, and I'm going to grab mine as well. We're short on time here, unfortunately. But I would simply remind you that when Jesus was with the disciples in the upper room, he took the bread and broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And so right now, I'd encourage you to take your bread and partake of it. This is Jesus' body, broken for us, and we partake in remembrance of him. When Jesus was with the disciples in the upper room, after the meal, it tells us that he took the cup and said, this cup is the new covenant. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. And so right now, I'd encourage you to take your cup. Friends, this is the blood of Christ shed for us. We drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray. God, in some ways, I'm so grateful for Simon Peter because his successes and failures helped me to know that none of us, including myself, none of us are beyond redemption. God, thank you for that. Help us to do what Jesus asked Peter to do, asked Simon to do. Help us to always be in the process